The night began, as most curious events do, with a dinner party that should have been entirely unremarkable. The wind from the moor sighed against the great granite walls of Sir Richard Haydon's house, a place the locals called the Grange, though to those of a more imaginative temperament it was whispered about as the Idol House. For beyond its terrace lay the desolate reaches of Dartmoor, black and glistening in the rain, where mists crawled like restless ghosts and the tors watched like ancient sentinels. Among the guests that evening was Miss Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead, invited as the companion of her old friend, Colonel Bantry. She had accepted, partly out of politeness, partly from that quiet curiosity she held for human nature in all its guises. To her mind, people were infinitely more interesting than places, though she admitted Dartmoor had a certain brooding grandeur that made one wonder how many secrets it might conceal beneath its fog. Sir Richard was a man of eccentric tastes and restless intellect. His latest passion, ancient religions, had given the evening its peculiar character. The drawing-room was dominated by a strange carved figure, a weathered stone idol said to represent Astarte, goddess of the moon and fertility. Around it, the firelight danced and flickered, casting long shadows that gave the impression of silent movement. The host, amused by his guests' nervous laughter, declared that before dinner they would perform a small ritual to honor the goddess. Merely a jest, he said. A touch of the primitive to enliven the evening. Miss Marple, seated quietly near the hearth, observed the company. There was Colonel Bantry, bluff and genial, pretending not to be unnerved. His wife, Mrs. Bantry, who found the whole thing deliciously wicked. Dr. Pritchard, a skeptical local physician with sharp eyes. Violet Turnbull, Sir Richard's young cousin, pale, thoughtful, and a little too quiet. And finally, Captain Rogers, whose air of bored detachment hid, Miss Marple thought, a rather watchful nature. The wind moaned through the chimney as Sir Richard extinguished the lamps, leaving only the trembling firelight. He handed each guest a torch and led them out onto the terrace, where the rain had slowed to a fine mist. Below them, the moor stretched wide and empty, and at its center stood the so-called Temple of Astarte, a circle of black stones half sunken in the earth, older than memory. "Now then," said Sir Richard, his voice carrying oddly in the damp air, "let us see if the goddess favors us." He raised his torch and began a mock invocation, the sort of thing one might read in an archaeological journal. Meaningless syllables, half Latin, half imagination. The others laughed uneasily. Miss Marple said nothing. She had noticed the way Violet Turnbull flinched at every word and the curious tension in Captain Rogers' jaw as the chant grew louder. Then, just as the wind fell still, a Bowa figure moved across the ring of stones. Tall, white, and ghost-like, illuminated for a single second by lightning. A collective gasp rose from the group. Sir Richard took one uncertain step forward and fell. When the lights came back, the others found him lying motionless on the wet grass, a small wound beneath his ribs. The torch he had carried still burned beside him, its light flickering against the impassive stones of the Idol House. For a long moment no one spoke. The moor was silent, save for the faint drip of rain from the eaves. Then Mrs. Bantry gave a strangled cry. Miss Marple did not move. She merely looked once at the fallen man, once at the idol, and then up toward the hill where the figure had vanished into mist. Her expression was not one of horror, but of quiet, pensive comprehension. The kind that comes only from recognizing a pattern she had seen long ago in the far more ordinary confines of a village drawing-room. Whatever had happened on Dartmoor that night, it was not the work of gods. It was, Miss Marple knew already, the work of someone very human indeed. Rain hung over the moor the following morning like a veil, soft and relentless, turning the lawns of the Grange into shallow mirrors of grey water. The guests had scarcely slept. Servants moved about with pale faces, their whispers dying away whenever a floorboard creaked. The body of Sir Richard had been carried into the library, laid beneath a white sheet, while a constable from the nearby village kept silent watch. No one spoke of gods or lightning now. Miss Marple sat near the fire, knitting quietly. The rhythm of her needles was slow, deliberate, as if each stitch helped her think. Around her, the air carried the faint smell of damp wool and burnt wood from the hearth. Colonel Bantry stood at the window, frowning at the drifting mist that obscured the stone circle. Dr. Pritchard paced, his hands clasped behind his back, repeating for what must have been the third time that the wound was too clean, too precise, to have been made by any accidental fall. It was a sharp instrument, perhaps a knife, driven in with considerable force, he said finally, his voice cutting through the uneasy quiet. Though how anyone could have come close enough in that darkness without being seen, well, that's beyond me. Violet Turnbull shivered and pressed a handkerchief to her lips. But there was someone, wasn't there? That figure. We all saw it. Yes, murmured Captain Rogers, his tone skeptical. We saw something. A trick of light, perhaps. The moor plays strange games with one's eyes. Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment. Oh, indeed it does, she said softly, though I've always thought it's not the moor that plays tricks, but the people upon it. No one quite knew how to answer that. The remark, mild as it was, carried a quiet sting of reason that seemed to unsettle everyone. Inspector Cray arrived shortly after noon, a P.O., stout man with a tidy moustache and the kind of authority that relies more on volume than intellect. He questioned each guest briskly, his pencil scratching impatiently on his pad. Miss Marple answered him with her usual gentle precision, offering nothing more than what she had seen. Yet even as she spoke, she was watching, not the inspector, but the faces around her. Violet's eyes darted toward the door whenever the moor was mentioned. Captain Rogers' fingers tapped the arm of his chair in a steady rhythm that betrayed tension rather than boredom. Mrs. Bantry seemed eager to fill the silence, her chatter spilling forth in nervous bursts. The inspector concluded that the matter was singular, but perhaps explainable. He intended, he said, to search the grounds. Miss Marple asked quietly if she might join him. He hesitated, then, seeing her as no more threat than an elderly spinster fond of fresh air, he agreed. Outside, the mist thickened into a pale shroud that clung to their clothes. The path to the stone circle was slick and uneven. The ground bore the marks of last night's torches, trampled grass, a few broken stems, but Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to something smaller. Near the edge of the ring, half hidden in the mud, was a faint impression of a shoe heel. Not a man's heavy boot, as one might expect on the moor, but something lighter. She said nothing, only bent slightly as if to catch her breath, and noted the pattern carefully, a diamond-shaped tread, unusually delicate. She thought of Violet's shoes, polished but unsuitable for the terrain, and then dismissed the thought at once. Premature conclusions were the ruin of truth. The inspector moved ahead, poking at the stones with the end of his stick. Superstition, he muttered. The locals will be saying the goddess took him. Mark my words. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, they will, Inspector. People are fond of mysteries when they do not touch them too closely. But this one, I think, is a little too human to be divine. That evening, when the guests gathered again for supper, the atmosphere was brittle. The servants avoided their eyes. Thunder rolled in the distance, though the rain had ceased. Miss Marple sat at the far end of the table, unnoticed, her teacup untouched. She listened to Captain Rogers speaking quietly to Violet, his words meant to reassure but sounding oddly forced. She caught the brief flash of fear in the girl's eyes. Fear, not grief, and that, more than anything, troubled her. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. Miss Marple turned her head toward the corridor. The lamps flickered once, then steadied. In that moment, she felt rather than saw the shift in the room, the strange undercurrent that told her the killer had not fled the moor. He was still here, somewhere between the shadows and the polite murmurs of tea and condolences, waiting for the next mistake to be made. And Miss Marple, with her soft smile and folded hands, intended to let him make it. The moor kept its silence through the night, as if it too were pondering the death of Sir Richard. By morning, a pale sun pushed weakly through the mist, turning the wet stones silver. The household stirred early, though no one spoke much at breakfast. The clinking of teaspoons and the rustle of the newspaper filled the uneasy air. Miss Marple took her tea with quiet patience, her eyes lowered, but her mind alert to every tone, every glance exchanged across the table. Violet Turnbull was late to breakfast. When she did appear, her face looked drawn, the color of porcelain under her dark hair. She murmured something about a headache and took only toast. Captain Rogers, sitting beside her, reached to pour her tea, his hand steady, his manner attentive. But Miss Marple noticed the faintest hesitation before he touched the pot, a hesitation that suggested thought, not care. Dr. Pritchard entered just then, his boots muddy from the moor. "No new footprints," he announced curtly, taking a seat without waiting to be invited. "I checked again this morning with the constable. Nothing but our own tracks from last night." Mrs. Bantry sighed. "Then the figure we saw was flesh and blood," Miss Marple interrupted softly. She did not look up as she spoke, her tone more reflective than assertive. For ghosts seldom leave footprints, and they never carry knives. A silence followed. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat uncomfortably, while the inspector, who had arrived just in time to hear her remark, frowned but said nothing. Miss Marple smiled faintly, as though to soften her own words. "We mustn't let our imaginations run away with us, must we?" The inspector gave her a polite nod. "Quite right, miss. Still, we've found no weapon, and no one left the house between the time of the storm and when we discovered the body, unless our murderer vanished into the mist." Miss Marple folded her napkin neatly. "People rarely vanish, Inspector. They merely find clever ways to remain unseen." That afternoon, the police searched the upper rooms of the Grange, assisted reluctantly by the guests. Miss Marple wandered with them, moving slowly, her manner that of a woman content merely to observe. In Sir Richard's study, the air was heavy with dust and old smoke. Books lined the shelves. Archaeological treatises, ancient mythologies, and several volumes on Eastern cults. On the desk lay a half-written letter, the ink smudged by rain or tears. She leaned closer, reading the unfinished sentence. "I must tell you before." And then nothing. The rest of the page was blank. A small vase of heather stood by the window, drooping. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it longer than one might expect. The vase was chipped near the rim, a rough-edged break. She wondered idly if it had been dropped or thrown. Downstairs, she heard the inspector's voice rising, questioning Captain Rogers about his movements during the ritual. The captain's replies were measured, too measured perhaps, as though rehearsed. "I was behind Violet," he said. "I saw the flash of light, then Sir Richard fell. That's all." Later, in the quiet of the afternoon, Miss Marple found Violet sitting alone in the conservatory, staring through the rain-speckled glass at the moor. The girl started when Miss Marple entered, then smiled faintly, trying to compose herself. "It's strange," Violet said after a pause. "He was so alive last night, so sure of everything." "People often seem most alive just before the end," Miss Marple murmured. She took a seat beside her. "You were fond of your cousin, I think." Violet hesitated. "He was kind to me, yes. Though lately, well, he'd become different, obsessed almost with that idol. He said it protected him." "Did it?" Violet looked down at her hands. "No," she whispered. Miss Marple studied her profile for a moment. "You know, my dear, fear makes people do peculiar things. It can make them cruel or desperate, but it can also make them careless." Violet said nothing. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she turned away, murmuring something about the air being too close. When she left the room, Miss Marple remained, her gaze drifting to the shadowed corners of the glass house, where damp ivy crept along the walls. She noticed a faint mark on the tiled floor, a smear of dried mud shaped like the toe of a woman's shoe. Outside, the inspector's whistle sounded faintly. Another discovery, perhaps. Miss Marple rose slowly, her knitting forgotten on the chair, and walked to the door. The light had changed again, the moor turning darker, flatter, as the mist thickened anew. Somewhere out there, among the stones and heather, lay the truth, waiting quietly, like a secret that would not stay buried. Miss Marple stepped outside. The chill wind caught her shawl and she drew it tighter. The investigation had only just begun, but already she could feel the rhythm of it. The slow unraveling of lies, the subtle tremor beneath polite conversation. There was always a pattern, always, and before the week was out, she meant to see it clearly. By evening, the moor had fallen into a restless quiet, the kind that seems to listen rather than speak. Inside the grange, the lamps had been lit early, their yellow glow casting long, trembling shapes across the drawing-room walls. The guests kept close together now, the easy laughter of the first night replaced by wary politeness. Death, Miss Marple thought, had a remarkable way of rearranging social boundaries. People who barely knew one another yesterday now whispered like intimates, while those once familiar kept their distance. She sat near the fire again, knitting resting in her lap, her eyes half-lidded but watchful. From where she sat she could see almost everything. Violet pretending to read by the window, her gaze unfocused. Captain Rogers, at the sideboard, pouring himself another drink, his movements stiff and deliberate. Dr. Pritchard standing before the mantel, watching the flames with an expression too thoughtful to be idle. It was a scene Miss Marple had seen often in smaller forms. After a quarrel in the Women's Institute, after a village scandal. Grief and guilt, though they wore different clothes, behaved in precisely the same way. The inspector returned from the moor just before supper, his boots heavy with mud, his face drawn. "We've found the weapon," he announced to the room, his voice clipped. "A knife. Small military issue, hidden beneath a loose stone at the edge of the circle." A murmur rippled through the group. Captain Rogers straightened. "A military knife. That's right, sir. You recognize the type, perhaps?" Rogers hesitated. "Many do. I carried one myself once in France. So did half the men of my generation." Miss Marple's eyes rested on him a moment too long, then drifted away as if she had lost interest. The inspector continued. "The handle was wiped clean, but there's a faint trace of something on the blade. Blood, almost certainly. No initials, no markings. Whoever placed it there knew what they were doing." Dr. Pritchard gave a low whistle. Then the murderer had time. Enough to return to the circle after the body was found. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Not necessarily, Doctor. People are often cleverer before a crime than after it. A hiding place chosen in panic seldom lasts the night." The inspector frowned, uncertain whether she was agreeing or contradicting him. Miss Marple smiled faintly and resumed her knitting. Later, when most of the guests had drifted away to their rooms, she found herself in the library again. The fire had burned low, throwing soft light upon the rows of books and the shrouded shape of Sir Richard's desk. She moved quietly, her slippered feet barely making a sound. On the table lay the same half-written letter she had seen before, but now she noticed something she had missed, a faint indentation on the blotter beside it, the ghost of a name pressed by the nib of a pen. She held the page to the firelight, tilting it until the words emerged faintly. "Dear V." She exhaled slowly. "Violet." A step sounded behind her, and she turned. Captain Rogers stood in the doorway, his face half in shadow. "You shouldn't be here alone, Miss Marple," he said. "It isn't pleasant, this room." "Ah," she said softly. "I've never found unpleasant places half so frightening as unpleasant people." He gave a small smile that did not reach his eyes. "You think I'm one of them?" "I think," said Miss Marple, setting the letter down, "that we all have our secrets, Captain. The difference lies in what we're willing to do to keep them." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Rogers inclined his head slightly and left, closing the door behind him. The latch clicked faintly, a careful sound, too deliberate to be casual. Miss Marple stood very still, listening to the retreating echo of his steps. Outside, the wind had risen again, moaning against the windows. Somewhere upstairs, a door banged shut, and a woman's voice, Violet's perhaps, cried out sharply, then fell silent. Miss Marple drew her shawl closer and walked toward the staircase. The house felt different now. Alive, watchful, its corridors thick with secrets pressing to be heard. She climbed the steps slowly, the old wood groaning beneath her, and as she reached the landing, she saw, beneath the flicker of the gaslight, a faint trail of damp footprints leading away from Violet's room toward the narrow passage that ended in the servants' stair. The inspector would be notified, of course, but Miss Marple already knew what she must do first. Listen, quietly and carefully, as she always had. For somewhere in the stillness of that great brooding house, someone was moving. Not all footsteps, she thought grimly, belonged to the living. The footprints led only a few steps before dissolving into the worn carpet of the narrow passage. Miss Marple paused there, the faint draught from the servant's stair stirring the lace at her sleeve. Somewhere below, a door closed quietly. Not the heavy slam of a frightened hand, but the deliberate push of someone careful not to wake the house. She waited a moment longer, listening to the wind gnawing at the window panes, then began her descent, one hand trailing the rail to steady herself on the dark steps. At the bottom, a single lamp burned in the scullery, throwing a low amber light across the flagstones. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, the only sound except for the faint drip from the tap. Miss Marple crossed to the door that led to the yard and touched the latch. Cold, wet from the outside air. Someone had been out recently. A smear of mud clung to the threshold, the same reddish hue as the soil from the moor. She knelt stiffly, her eyes narrowing. Among the irregular shapes of boot marks was the lighter imprint of a smaller sole, almost certainly a woman's. She traced its edge with a gloved finger, then straightened slowly, a small sigh escaping her. She had not long returned to the hall when she heard movement above. Hurried, light footsteps retreating across the landing. The house, she thought, was very nearly alive tonight, every sound echoing with some unspoken intention. She returned quietly to her room and sat by the small writing desk, the candle's flame trembling as if reluctant to stay. From the corridor came a whisper of voices, the inspector's and the colonel's. They were discussing the weapon, how cleanly it had been wiped, how deliberate the hiding place had been. Miss Marple listened absently while noting a few details in her small notebook, a habit she seldom admitted to but had found indispensable. In the morning, the house awoke to news that Violet was unwell. Dr. Pritchard had been summoned early. The girl was confined to her bed, pale and trembling. Miss Marple came quietly to her room with a tray of tea, ignoring the maid's protests. Violet lay against the pillows, her eyes heavy but restless. The air smelled faintly of something sharp. Camphor, perhaps, or spirits of ammonia. "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, setting down the tray, "you've given us all a fright. The inspector says you've been out of sorts." Violet shook her head weakly. "Just a headache. I couldn't sleep." "Ah, yes. Terrible things, sleepless nights. One's thoughts do tend to wander in unhelpful directions." Violet said nothing. Her hands, folded on the blanket, twisted slightly at the fingers. Miss Marple noticed the faint trace of soil beneath one nail, a brownish tinge that would have gone unseen to most eyes. She poured the tea with steady hands. Do take a sip, my dear. It will settle you. You've had such a dreadful shock." Violet obeyed, though her eyes were on the window. Beyond the glass, the moor glimmered under the thin morning light, all silver and shadow. "You don't believe in that goddess, do you, Miss Marple?" she asked suddenly. "Astarte, Sir Richard did. He said her spirit protected the house." Miss Marple's voice was mild. "I believe most things that frighten people begin with something true, my dear, and end with something human. The divine, I find, rarely has fingerprints." Violet smiled faintly, then turned her face away. When Miss Marple left the room, she found Captain Rogers waiting at the end of the corridor. He looked tired, unshaven, and though he smiled politely, his eyes were cautious. "You're wasting your time with her," he said. "She's frightened out of her wits. Best let the inspector handle it." "Oh, I'm sure he'll do splendidly," Miss Marple said, drawing her shawl closer. "But one never knows which small thing might prove useful. You, for instance. You were the last to see Sir Richard alive. Did he seem troubled?" Rogers hesitated. "He spoke of letters. Said someone meant to betray him. I thought it was just drink and superstition." "Letters," Miss Marple repeated softly. "How curious." He gave a short laugh. "Everything about this place is curious." As he turned away, Miss Marple watched him go, her expression unreadable. Then she moved quietly to the study once more, where sunlight fell pale and cold upon the desk. She lifted the blotter again, turning it this time toward the light. Beneath the faint mark of Dear V, another line appeared. Fainter still, almost invisible. She fetched a pencil from the drawer and gently rubbed its side across the paper. The shadow of words emerged. "You must burn them before—" Her eyes lingered on the half-formed sentence. Burn them. Letters, perhaps. She thought of Violet's trembling hands, of the smell of smoke that had drifted faintly from the servants' passage the night before. Somewhere in this house, something had been destroyed, but not completely. And Miss Marple, with her unerring patience, intended to find whatever the fire had failed to swallow. The faint pencil mark still lingered on the page when Miss Marple heard footsteps in the corridor. Slow, measured, as though someone approached with purpose rather than hesitation. She slipped the blotter neatly back into place and turned just as Inspector Cray entered. His face was lined with fatigue. He looked, Miss Marple thought, like a man trying to reason with fog. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, attempting a polite smile. "Still in the thick of it, I see. I was hoping you might help me make sense of something. We've found traces of burnt paper in the servant's stove. Small bits, barely readable. Looked like the edge of a letter." Miss Marple folded her hands. "That doesn't surprise me, Inspector. People do tend to burn things when they wish to forget them. Unfortunately, fire is a poor accomplice. It never quite finishes the job." He regarded her for a moment. "You've seen something, haven't you?" "I've noticed something," she corrected softly, "which is not quite the same thing, though often rather more useful." The inspector gave a short laugh, then sighed. "The doctor's pressing me to make an arrest. He says the wound was too deliberate for a stranger's hand. I've half a mind to bring in Rogers. Ex-military, temper, and that knife could easily have been his." Miss Marple looked mildly pained. "I should think Captain Rogers is far too careful a man to strike in anger, Inspector, and far too proud to hide the evidence so clumsily." "Clumsily?" "Oh, yes. The stone where the knife was hidden. Quite an obvious place, really. The kind of thing one would expect to be found. It suggests haste, but not fear. Someone wanted the weapon discovered, I think, but in such a way that suspicion might fall in a convenient direction." Cray frowned. "You mean someone's trying to frame him?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not frame precisely, more like guide your attention. People do love to tidy up the truth when it starts to look untidy." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices from the hall. The inspector muttered something under his breath and strode out, and Miss Marple followed at her usual unhurried pace. Captain Rogers and Dr. Pritchard were standing at the base of the stairs, their tempers barely restrained. "I'm telling you," Rogers said sharply, "someone's been in my room. My drawer was locked last night, and this morning it's open. And the spare knife I keep there is gone." Dr. Pritchard crossed his arms. "Perhaps you misplaced it." "I don't misplace weapons," Rogers snapped. Miss Marple's quiet voice slipped through the tension like a thread through cloth. "You're quite sure? It was locked, Captain." He turned toward her, still bristling. "Yes, I always lock it. It's a habit. From the war." "And who has a key?" "No one," he said too quickly. Then, after a pause, "At least I didn't think so." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her expression mild but her eyes bright. Locks, I've always found, are rather optimistic inventions. They suggest that honesty is a matter of furniture, when it's really a matter of character. The inspector took control then, sending the men in opposite directions to cool their tempers. Miss Marple remained where she was, her gaze lingering on the staircase. The carpet bore faint smudges of soot, not enough to notice at a glance, but distinct if one had been trained to see such things. She followed them quietly up to the landing, where they ended near a small side table that held a vase of wilting flowers. She lifted the vase carefully. Beneath it was a single scrap of charred paper, half an inch wide, the edge curling inward like a burned leaf. Holding it delicately, she made out 2 faint words in smudged ink. "The night." She placed it inside her pocket and returned to her room, where she sat a long time by the window, watching the fog drift in from the moor. The pattern was becoming clearer now. Not the identity of the killer, not yet, but the rhythm of their fear. Someone in the house had written something dangerous, something they could not afford to let survive, and someone else, Miss Marple suspected, had already read it. When the supper bell rang, she descended with her usual quiet dignity. The atmosphere at table was brittle, the conversation scattered. Violet had not come down. Dr. Pritchard explained she was sleeping under the influence of a mild sedative. Captain Rogers drank in silence, and Mrs. Bantry, trying to fill the dreadful hush, began speaking of the weather. Halfway through the meal, the wind rose sharply, rattling the windows. In the pause that followed, there came another sound, faint but unmistakable, the distant echo of footsteps crossing the terrace toward the idle stones. The inspector was first to stand. "Who's out there?" he demanded, but Miss Marple had already risen. "I shouldn't call out, Inspector," she said softly. "You might frighten them away, and I have an idea we'd rather like them to think they're still unseen." Without waiting for a reply, she took her shawl and moved toward the door, the others following. Outside, the air was raw, the night cold enough to bite. The moor stretched before them, pale in the moonlight. And there, at the edge of the circle of stones, a figure knelt, small against the vast dark, its hands digging at the earth. The inspector lifted his lantern. "Who's there?" The figure froze, then turned. The light fell upon her face, white, terrified, and streaked with tears. It was Violet Turnbull. But what made Miss Marple's heart quicken was not the girl's fear. It was the glint of metal in her trembling hand, catching the moonlight like a whisper of confession. For a moment, no one moved. The lantern light trembled in the inspector's hand, its glow catching the wet gleam of the idle stones and the pale face of the girl before them. Violet knelt rigidly, the small blade half buried in her fist, her breath rising in sharp, uneven bursts. Her lips parted as though she meant to speak, but only a sound escaped, a thin, broken whimper that seemed swallowed by the wind. "Put it down, Miss Turnbull," the inspector said quietly, stepping forward. His voice carried the firmness of authority, but not unkindness. "There's been enough of this. Give it here." Violet obeyed without a word. The knife fell into the grass with a dull thud. As the inspector bent to retrieve it, Miss Marple came closer, her face calm but intent. The young woman looked up then, her eyes wide, unfocused, like someone caught between memory and waking. "I was only—" she began, then stopped, her throat tightening. "I thought if I buried it, it would be over." "Over?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, so quiet that even the inspector paused. "My dear child, what would be over?" Violet's hands twisted together. "The curse," she whispered. "He said it was bound to the knife, that as long as it remained in the open, Astarte would claim another life. I thought if I hid it again—" Her voice broke, and Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. "Superstition can be quite comforting, can't it? It offers such tidy explanations for very untidy actions." She looked toward the idol stone, the carved face glistening with dew. "But I rather think this particular goddess has less to do with death than the living who've used her name." The inspector led Violet back toward the house, his lantern swinging over the wet path. She walked between them silently, her head bowed, while Miss Marple kept a steady pace beside her, her eyes drawn not to the girl but to the shadows that moved along the windows of the grange. Someone was watching. Of that she was certain. Inside, the drawing-room fire had burned low, its embers dull and red. Dr. Pritchard was waiting there, his dressing gown loosely tied, a cigarette trembling faintly between his fingers. He rose as they entered, his expression caught between concern and calculation. "Good heavens, what's happened?" "Violet." "She was outside," the inspector said shortly. "With this." He placed the knife on the table, its blade dull with damp soil. Pritchard's gaze flicked to it, then to Violet. "My dear girl," he said softly, "you shouldn't have gone out alone. You're not well." "I'm not mad," she whispered, her voice brittle. "You told him to burn them, didn't you? The letters? You told him—" "Now really, Violet," Pritchard interrupted, a touch too quickly. "This is neither the time nor the—" But Violet's sudden cry cut him off. "He killed him. He said Sir Richard was a fool, that he'd ruin everything." The room froze. The inspector straightened sharply, but Miss Marple's expression did not change. She only watched the doctor with her calm, mild eyes, the kind that missed nothing. He took a step back, his composure faltering for the first time. "You've been listening to hysteria," he said. "The girl's delirious. None of this." Miss Marple's voice slipped in softly, cutting through his protest with disarming gentleness. "Delirium is a curious thing, Doctor. It often reveals what truth tries so hard to hide. You see, I found the remnants of one of those letters, the ones you meant to destroy. It mentioned a meeting. The night, it said. The night of the ritual, perhaps." Pritchard's jaw tightened. "You're making dangerous assumptions, Miss Marple." "Oh, I make very few assumptions," she said pleasantly. "But I do observe, and I couldn't help noticing that Sir Richard's handwriting was quite distinctive. Long downward strokes, heavy pressure, whereas yours, when you signed the police statement, was nearly identical in form, almost as though you'd been practicing it." The inspector turned to him sharply. "Is that true, Doctor?" Pritchard opened his mouth, then closed it again. The fire hissed softly, sending up a faint curl of smoke. Miss Marple continued, her tone still mild. "It's always the small things that betray us. Handwriting, an unnecessary phrase, a misplaced key. You see, when I found that faint mark on the letter, Dear V, I thought it strange that Sir Richard would address his cousin so intimately in writing. He was a formal man, by all accounts. It seemed much more likely that someone else had forged it, hoping she'd believe he'd written to her." Violet had begun to weep quietly. Pritchard's composure broke then, just slightly, but enough. His shoulders sagged, the cigarette trembling. "He was going to expose me," he said hoarsely. "The idol was a lie, a story I fed him. He believed I could summon something. It amused him at first, then frightened him. He was ready to tell the others, to ruin me. I only meant to frighten him, make him think the goddess demanded a sacrifice. But gods, said Miss Marple softly, have a dreadful way of turning on their creators, don't they? The inspector stepped forward, but Pritchard only shook his head, his voice small now, stripped of arrogance. I didn't mean for it to happen. The storm, the lights, it all went wrong. He stumbled. And then, Miss Marple looked at him for a long moment. And then you thought to let the superstition finish what you began. He sank into a chair, his face ashen. Outside, the wind rose again, moaning softly over the moor. Miss Marple turned to the inspector. You'll find the rest of the letters behind the panel in his study. He was too tidy to truly burn them all. The truth, I found, rarely burns clean. The inspector nodded grimly and gave orders to the constable. Violet, still trembling, leaned against Miss Marple's shoulder, her tears silent now. When all was over and the house grew quiet again, Miss Marple remained by the fire. She watched the last of the embers fade, her thoughts far away. The moor outside was dark once more, the idol still standing against the wind, a relic of fear, nothing more. People, she thought, would always invent their gods. The real danger lay not in worshipping them, but in pretending those gods were not simply reflections of themselves. Morning came without light. A thick, pewter sky hung low over the moor, and the mist pressed against the windows like damp hands. The air inside the grange felt drained, emptied of its storm. Inspector Cray had left before dawn, taking Dr. Pritchard under guard to Exeter. The servants moved quietly, their voices hushed as though afraid to wake the echoes that still lingered in the house. Miss Marple sat at the breakfast table, her teacup cooling beside her. The room felt strangely hollow now that the danger had passed, but she knew it had not entirely lifted. Evil seldom departs in a single night. It lingers, thin and invisible, in the corners of memory. Colonel Bantry read the paper aloud in a distracted way, while his wife busied herself buttering toast she would not eat. Violet had not yet come down. At last, Miss Marple rose and walked to the window. The idol stones were just visible through the haze, their shapes blurred, indistinct, like guilt seen through time. "Poor child," she murmured, almost to herself. "It will be a long while before she understands that her terror was never divine." Mrs. Bantry looked up. "Do you really think she'll recover, Jane?" "After all that?" Miss Marple gave a small, weary smile. "Oh, people do recover, my dear, but they rarely remain unchanged. Violet has seen something she can never quite forget. Not the act itself, but the deceit that made her believe it sacred. One learns from such things, though the lesson is never pleasant." Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "Still can't quite believe the doctor was behind it all. A rational man, they said. Rational men don't talk about goddesses." "Rational men," Miss Marple said softly, "are often the most dangerous when they start to believe in themselves." The rest of the morning passed in uneasy quiet. By midday, Violet appeared at the doorway, wrapped in a dark shawl, her eyes hollow but dry. She moved with the slow grace of exhaustion and came to stand beside Miss Marple. "They've gone, then?" "Yes, my dear," Miss Marple said. "It's finished now." Violet nodded faintly, her gaze drifting toward the moor. "I keep hearing his voice," she whispered. "Sir Richard's? It's strange. I was afraid of him for so long. Now it's pity I feel." Miss Marple's expression softened. "That's the beginning of forgiveness, I think. It's not given to the dead. It's given to the living who must remember them." Violet turned to her suddenly. "How did you know, Miss Marple? Before anyone else? Even before I understood what was happening?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, one never truly knows at first. But I've learned that evil, like mildew, leaves its mark on certain kinds of people long before it blooms. There was a particular neatness about Dr. Pritchard's mind. too neat for life's disorder, and when a man begins to tidy up his conscience as he would a desk, one must always be suspicious. Violet managed a small, fragile smile. "I think you must see more than you ever say." "That's very kind," Miss Marple said, though her eyes remained thoughtful. "But observation is quite a humble thing, really. It begins by admitting how often one has been wrong." Later that day, Miss Marple walked the moor one final time before her departure. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth, the sound of distant crows echoing over the hills. She paused by the stone circle. The idol stood as before. Cold, indifferent, its face eroded by centuries. She touched the base lightly with her gloved hand and noticed, half buried in the soil, a small silver button. She picked it up, turning it in the light. It bore the faint crest of the Royal Medical Corps. She smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. "Even in confession," she murmured, "people forget the smallest detail." By the time she returned to the house, the carriage was waiting. Violet stood on the steps, clutching her shawl. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. "You saved my life." Miss Marple shook her head. "No, my dear. You saved it yourself, when you chose to tell the truth." She laid a gentle hand on the girl's arm. "The rest, I think, is merely human nature, and that, as I've found, is far more mysterious than any goddess of stone." The coachman helped her up, and with a small nod to the Bantrys, Miss Marple settled into her seat. As the carriage rolled away, she glanced once more through the misted window at the Grange, its windows dull and unlit, its story concluded for now. Yet even as the moor swallowed the house behind her, she could not help but think that Dartmoor would keep its silence and its secrets for another 100 years at least. Miss Marple folded her hands, closed her eyes, and let the rhythm of the wheels carry her home, where the world, in its quiet and endless way, would go on being ordinary and infinitely dangerous. The journey back to St. Mary Mead was long and quiet, the countryside slipping past in a grey blur of hedgerows and autumn fields. Miss Marple sat motionless for most of it, her thoughts turned inward, her expression serene but far from idle. It was not the crime itself that lingered in her mind. Crimes, after all, were simply expressions of the eternal frailty of human nature, but rather the small things that followed them, the silences, the changed faces, the ways in which life reshaped itself after deceit had been laid bare. When she arrived home, the village seemed almost absurdly peaceful. The church bell was ringing for evensong, and the scent of wood smoke drifted from every chimney. Her little cottage looked exactly as she had left it, the geraniums drooping slightly in the window boxes, the cat curled asleep on the doorstep, unimpressed by her absence. Inside, the clock ticked with its usual self-importance, and Miss Marple went about the familiar business of making tea. But as she stirred the pot, she found her mind still straying to Dartmoor, to the sound of the wind over the stones, to Violet's pale face in the lantern light, and to that small silver button she had slipped into her reticule before leaving the Grange. It lay now on the table beside her teacup, catching the weak afternoon sun, a relic, perhaps, of a man's pride. She picked it up thoughtfully. The crest was clear. Royal Medical Corps. It might have belonged to Dr. Pritchard, of course, but something in its placement had troubled her. Found not near the idol where he claimed the fatal confrontation had occurred, but further off, near the northern edge of the moor, where the earth had been disturbed in a curious circular pattern. She had noticed it only briefly, a patch of churned soil that didn't fit the story he told, and she wondered now whether all of Pritchard's confession had been truth, or whether, in the end, even his surrender had been another form of deceit. The thought lingered uneasily. She had seen before how guilt could take many shapes: defiance, sorrow, even convenience. A man might admit to one sin simply to bury another. A knock at the door interrupted her. It was the postman, grinning as he handed her 2 envelopes. "Evening post, Miss Marple. One from Devon, looks like." She thanked him, took the letters inside, and settled again by the fire. The first was from Mrs. Bantry, a friendly note full of village gossip and gratitude for her help. The second, however, was in a hand she did not recognize. Neat, formal, and strangely deliberate. She opened it carefully. The paper was fine, the ink heavy and dark. "Madam," it began, "you do not know me, though I am connected to the late Dr. Pritchard through professional circles. I write only to inform you that certain materials belonging to him have been found among his effects. Notes of a chemical nature, relating not to archaeology as supposed, but to a rather dangerous experiment involving plant toxins. It may interest you to know that one of these notes bears the name of Sir Richard Haydon." Miss Marple read the letter twice before setting it down. So, not gods then, nor madness, but poison. A more mundane sort of evil, and therefore a more believable one. She sat back in her chair, a faint smile tugging at her lips. It was almost comforting in its way. The kettle began to hum softly on the stove, and she rose to pour herself another cup of tea. Outside, twilight gathered over the village, blurring the edges of the world. She glanced once more at the silver button, now gleaming faintly in the dim light, and thought of how very small such things were. The clues that unmade illusions, the tokens that told the truth about men. And as the clock struck 6, she murmured to herself, "There are always 2 stories, you know, the one people tell and the one they live. The trick, I suppose, is in knowing which one killed them." The kettle whistled then, and she turned away, her expression calm once more. But deep in her eyes there was that quiet, unyielding glint, the one that meant Miss Marple, though home again, was not quite done with Dartmoor yet. The letter lay on the table long after the tea had gone cold. Miss Marple sat very still, her eyes fixed upon the handwriting, the kind of precise, measured script that belonged to a man accustomed to restraint. It was not a threatening letter, nor even particularly emotional, but there was something about its tone that unsettled her. It was too careful, too considered, as though the writer had weighed every word before committing it to ink. That, in her experience, was seldom the mark of a man without guilt. By the next morning, she had written back with her usual neat economy, thanking the sender for his information and asking, quite innocently, whether she might be permitted to examine the notes he mentioned. The post went out at 10, and by afternoon, as she trimmed the dead leaves from her garden, she found her thoughts circling again around the same point. Plant toxins. Not a subject most physicians pursued lightly, nor one linked to archaeology unless one wished to explain a death without blood. She recalled Sir Richard's face that first night on the moor. Flushed with excitement, perhaps a little fear, the way a man looks when he believes he's touched something forbidden. But if Pritchard had indeed been experimenting, if his goddess had merely been a mask for science, then there was still a question left unanswered. Why the ritual? Why the elaborate theatre of Astarte at all? 2 days later, the reply arrived. The letter bore the seal of the Devon Constabulary and was signed by Superintendent Eales himself. "Miss Marple," it read, "your reputation for discernment precedes you. You will find enclosed a copy of Dr. Pritchard's notes, recovered from a locked drawer in his consulting room. The handwriting is erratic, but one passage may be of interest. Extract causes hallucination, paralysis within minutes if inhaled directly. Tested on small animals. Sir R. observed. Appeared disturbed. Insisted sample be destroyed. I refused." Miss Marple read the passage twice, her lips pursed in thought. It was not guilt that killed Sir Richard, she realized, nor superstition, nor even revenge. It was control. Pritchard had wished to frighten him, yes, but he had also wished to prove himself. to show that intellect could wield the same oar as faith. He had wanted power, and when power became dangerous, he had chosen concealment over confession, a small distinction, but fatal. That evening she lit the fire and sat quietly in her chair, the silver button gleaming faintly on the mantelpiece beside the letter. She had considered returning it to the police, but something in her resisted. It was not evidence anymore, merely a reminder, the physical echo of a man who had believed himself untouchable, and in that arrogance lay the seed of his undoing. As the flames rose and the room filled with warmth, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. Dartmoor seemed very far away now, yet it lingered in her mind. The moor's vast loneliness, the faint cry of wind through the stones, and the peculiar way fear could make people see divinity where there was only deceit. Violet, she thought, would recover in time. She was young, and youth, unlike guilt, forgets quickly. A soft knock came at the door. It was Mr. Petherick, the local solicitor, his hat dripping from the drizzle outside. "Forgive the intrusion, Miss Marple," he said, setting his briefcase down. "I've been asked by Inspector Cray to deliver this. Seems there's been a small matter unsettled regarding the Grange." He handed her a folded document. It was an amended will, Sir Richard's, dated just a week before his death. Miss Marple scanned the contents quickly, her brows lifting slightly. A small bequest to Dr. Pritchard for services rendered in connection with certain research. The remainder of the estate left to Violet Turnbull. "Curious, isn't it?" the solicitor said. "A physician's fee, perhaps, though it's oddly worded." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "Oddly worded, and oddly timed." She folded the paper carefully, her mind already moving ahead. "Tell me, Mr. Petherick, do you recall whether that will was witnessed in the village or at the Grange?" "The Grange, I believe," he said. "Why do you ask?" She smiled faintly. "Because I should very much like to see who signed it." That night, long after Mr. Petherick had gone and the fire had burned low, Miss Marple examined the signature line under her reading lamp. There were two witnesses. One was a servant, she recalled vaguely. The other was Captain Rogers. The silver button caught the light again, its engraved crest flashing faintly like an answer she had not wanted to hear. For the first time, Miss Marple frowned. Perhaps, after all, Dartmoor's secrets had not yet settled into silence. She leaned back in her chair, her mind knitting itself into quiet focus. Captain Rogers had been a soldier, a man used to command, and men of that sort, she knew, did not stay long in the orbit of other men's guilt without acquiring a measure of it themselves. It was not quite over. Not yet. Outside, the rain began to fall steadily, tapping against the window like fingers eager to be let in. Miss Marple glanced once more at the will, then at the button, and murmured under her breath, "How inconveniently persistent the truth can be." The following morning brought no clarity, only rain, steady, persistent, and soft enough to erase footprints on the garden path. Miss Marple watched it through the window as she poured her tea, her mind quietly turning over the few facts that had refused to settle into place. The doctor's guilt had seemed complete, his confession detailed, even pitiful in its honesty. Yet there remained the matter of the will, and of Captain Rogers, whose name sat beside the servants like an afterthought that did not belong. She fetched the document again from the writing desk and examined the signatures. The servant's was small, uneven, a hand used to scrubbing floors rather than holding pens. Rogers was another matter entirely. Bold, sweeping, written by someone quite aware that he was being watched. It was a performance of steadiness, of control, and that, she thought, was precisely what troubled her. By afternoon the post arrived. Another letter, again from Devon, though this time in a more hurried hand. It was from Inspector Cray. "Dr. Pritchard has died in custody," it began. "Suicide by poison. Left no statement save one line. The gods will not be mocked. We've confirmed your suspicion about the toxins. However, there's a discrepancy regarding Sir Richard's papers. The portion of his research describing distribution of the substance is missing. Thought you should know." Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and stared into the fire. Suicide, or something meant to appear as such. Either way, it left her with a question that had not been asked. Who, exactly, had removed those missing papers? Pritchard was too proud to destroy his own work. Someone else had done it. Someone who still had reason to keep what was left hidden. That evening she walked to the post office under her umbrella. The air smelled of wet soil and coal smoke, and the street lamps glowed like small golden moons through the fog. Mrs. Finch, behind the counter, greeted her cheerfully. "Letter going out, Miss Marple?" "Yes," she said with a polite smile, slipping the envelope onto the counter. "To a certain Captain Rogers, care of Exeter Police." It was a small note, courteous, even friendly, inviting him to tea on his next visit to St. Mary Mead. There were questions, she wrote, that only a man of his experience could answer. She signed it with her usual grace and returned home, her steps steady despite the cold. 3 days later, he arrived. The village, ever eager for novelty, took mild interest in his visit. A tall man in a dark coat, polished and calm, with eyes that missed little. He greeted Miss Marple with warmth and the faint irony of someone humoring an elderly lady. "You said you had questions, Miss Marple," he began as she poured the tea. "I can't imagine what more there is to know. The case is quite finished." Miss Marple stirred her cup gently. "Yes, I suppose it must seem so. Dr. Pritchard dead, the mystery tidied up. So very English, don't you think? But there was one small thing that didn't quite fit, the matter of the will." He smiled faintly. "Ah, yes. I was present. Sir Richard asked me to witness it. A dull business." "Quite dull," she agreed, "except that Sir Richard, according to his valet, could barely hold a pen after his accident with the chemical vapors. His hand trembled badly. Yet the signature on the will is strong, confident, rather like yours." The pause that followed was brief but full. Roger's eyes, for a fraction of a second, hardened, not with surprise, but calculation. "I see," he said at last, leaning back. "You're very observant, Miss Marple, but observation can be misleading." "Oh, frequently," she replied, "though not, I think, when one also listens." She reached into the drawer and drew out the small silver button, placing it carefully on the table between them. "You dropped this, I believe, on the moor. I found it near the disturbed soil, the spot where something had been buried. I imagine it was the missing portion of Sir Richard's notes, yes? Buried, perhaps, before the police could search your room." For a moment he said nothing. Then he laughed softly, almost admiringly. "You've a sharp mind, madam, but I think you overestimate me." "On the contrary," she said gently, "I think I may have underestimated you. You see, Dr. Pritchard's arrogance might have led him to murder, but it took a far more practical man to make it profitable. The will gave you control over the estate's assets as executor. The research, well, that could fetch quite a price in certain circles. You forged the signature, Captain, and when Sir Richard began to suspect, you let Pritchard take the fall." The faintest smile curved his lips. "You have no proof." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "Proof is rarely what convinces people, Captain. It's conscience, and you'll find yours is less easily buried than a bundle of papers." He rose then, his composure cracking just slightly, enough to reveal the cold precision beneath the charm. "You're quite remarkable, Miss Marple, I'll grant you that, but sometimes it's best to leave sleeping gods where they lie." He left without another word. She listened to the sound of his car fading down the lane, the rain beginning again in soft, steady drifts. Then she sat very still, watching the silver button gleam faintly in the firelight. She knew he would not go far. Men like Captain Rogers never did. Their pasts had a way of circling back like the moor's mist, silent patient, and certain. When the inspector's telegram arrived the following morning, confirming that the captain's car had been found abandoned near Exeter, the passenger door open to the riverbank, Miss Marple merely folded it and set it aside. "Human nature," she murmured to herself, refilling her cup. Always the same pattern. Pride, deceit, and the smallest of mistakes. Even gods would envy such consistency. Outside, the rain thinned to a drizzle. The moor, she thought, would be quiet now, for a while. It was late afternoon when the telegram came from Exeter confirming Captain Rogers' disappearance. The rain had eased by then, leaving the village steeped in a thin mist that blurred the hedgerows and silvered the roofs. Miss Marple read the message by the window, her expression composed, though her eyes reflected a faint shadow of sadness. Tragedy, she thought, had a way of completing its own circle. The constable who delivered the telegram lingered awkwardly, his boots dripping on the mat. "Dreadful business, ma'am," he said. "They found the motor car half submerged by the river. No sign of the captain himself. They say the current's strong this time of year." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "Rivers are most obliging when people wish to disappear, and most inconvenient when they change their minds." When he left, she folded the telegram neatly, set it on the mantel beside the silver button, and stared at them both. The room was quiet, except for the gentle ticking of the clock. She knew the case would be closed soon enough. Official reports would say that Captain Rogers, haunted by his involvement, had taken his own life. But Miss Marple, who had watched human nature for far too long to be comforted by tidy conclusions, could not quite believe in that simplicity. She spent the evening by the fire, knitting slowly, her thoughts looping and unlooping like the wool between her fingers. Rogers had been too deliberate, too self-contained. Men who take their own lives rarely bother with careful farewells. And there had been that small thing, the second set of muddy footprints outside her gate the night before his visit. Too large to be hers, too recent to belong to anyone else in the village. Someone had been watching. The following morning brought confirmation of her unease. A letter arrived without a return address, postmarked from Plymouth. Inside, a single sheet, written in that same elegant, deliberate hand. "Thank you, Miss Marple, for your insight. The gods, it seems, have not finished with us after all." No signature. Only a faint smudge at the bottom of the page, as though a thumb had brushed damp ink. She read it twice, then folded it carefully into an envelope marked, "To be forwarded to Inspector Cray." There was nothing more to say. If Rogers had lived, he would be found soon enough. If not, the river would tell its own truth in time. Days passed. The weather cleared. Life in St. Mary Mead returned. To its gentle rhythm, Mrs. Price Ridley's endless gossip about the vicarage, the sound of the milk cart in the morning, the cat sleeping by the hearth. Yet beneath the calm, Miss Marple felt a curious stillness inside her, like the pause before a final note resolves. She often found her gaze wandering to the mantelpiece, where only the silver button remained now, polished bright as a coin. One evening, as twilight deepened and the first star appeared above the church spire, she slipped the button into her palm and whispered, "There are always two endings, just as there are two beginnings. The one we tell others, and the one that tells itself." She dropped it into the fire, and the metal hissed faintly before darkening to ash. Outside, the rain began again, soft and persistent. Somewhere far off, beyond the quiet hedges and the ordered gardens of the village, the moor stretched endlessly toward the sea. And there, beneath the drifting mist, the stones of the Idol House still stood, mute, patient, and eternal, bearing witness to yet another small story of human folly, which time, mercifully, would soon forget. A week passed before the news came. It arrived by way of a thin, official-looking envelope, delivered early in the morning when the fog still lay thick upon the hedgerows. Miss Marple recognized the handwriting on the front before she even opened it. Inspector Cray's, firm and unhurried, the sort of hand that spoke of patient men and unending paperwork. She slit it open neatly with the butter knife beside her breakfast plate. "Captain Rogers' body has been recovered," the letter began. "Found some miles downstream, caught against a fallen branch near the estuary. Coroner's report suggests drowning, though certain details remain inconsistent. A bruise on the temple, possibly from the fall, possibly not. We found fragments of a small vial in his coat pocket. No sign of the missing papers. I thought you'd wish to know." Miss Marple sat for a moment, the letter held lightly between her fingers. Outside, the morning light was slow to gather, the village still drowsy and grey. She folded the paper carefully and set it beside her teacup, then turned her gaze to the window. The mist was lifting, just enough to reveal the faint shimmer of dew on the garden wall. It struck her, as it often did, how peace and deceit could share the same stillness. Later that afternoon, she walked to the post office, her steps unhurried. She exchanged pleasantries with Mrs. Finch, then paused to glance at the notice board by the door. There, pinned beneath the usual advertisements for poultry feed and piano lessons, was a small clipping from the Exeter Gazette. Body of former officer found in river. Foul play not suspected. The phrase, printed so confidently, seemed to her the most suspicious thing of all. On her way home, she stopped by the vicarage to deliver a basket of apples from her garden. The vicar, always eager for a sympathetic ear, spoke at length about the sermon he was preparing, something on moral decay in the modern age. Miss Marple listened politely, though her mind was elsewhere, tracing the thin line between accident and intention, between remorse and self-preservation. That evening, as the shadows lengthened across the parlor floor, she sat by the fire and reread Inspector Cray's letter. The bruise troubled her. It was not so much what it was, but where it was, on the temple above the right ear. A blow delivered not by the fall of water, but by the deliberate hand of someone standing close enough to strike. Rogers, she thought, had not gone willingly into the river. Someone had ensured his silence. She rose, went to her writing desk, and retrieved from its drawer a small envelope she had kept untouched for days, the anonymous note from Plymouth. Holding it up to the lamplight, she noticed what she had missed before, a faint watermark, visible only in the glow. The emblem of a shipping company. Devon Coastal Lines, the very firm that operated the transport barges along the estuary where Rogers had been found. The pattern was beginning to take shape again. 2 days later, she received another visitor. The constable from Much Benham stood awkwardly in her doorway, his cap in his hands. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple," he said, "but there's someone asking after you at the inn. A man says he's a clerk from Devon Coastal Lines. Thought I'd best tell you before he called round. Did he leave a name?" "Price, ma'am, said you'd be expecting him." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How very polite of Mr. Price. Perhaps you'd be kind enough to ask him to wait." When she arrived at the inn, the man stood as she entered. A thin, fair-haired fellow in a worn suit, his hat crushed nervously in his hands. His eyes darted toward her with the quick precision of someone accustomed to secrets. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "I was told you'd understand. It's about Captain Rogers." She gestured for him to sit. "Then you must tell me everything, Mr. Price." He swallowed hard. "I loaded the captain's car onto the ferry the night before he was found. He wasn't alone, ma'am. There was another man with him, dark coat, quiet sort, paid me not to ask questions. But when the car came off again on the other side, only Rogers was inside." Miss Marple's eyes met his, calm and steady. "You're quite sure?" "I'd swear it. I thought it odd at the time. The second man, he wore gloves, though the night was warm, and when he gave me the coin, I noticed his cuff. It had a crest stitched in gold thread. Same as the button, I think." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Miss Marple gave a small nod, her voice no louder than a whisper. "Yes, I rather thought it might come back to that." The man looked puzzled, but she only smiled, thanked him for his trouble, and rose. As she stepped back into the evening air, the mist was beginning to rise again over the fields. Somewhere, far beyond the village, the moor waited, silent, timeless, patient. She drew her shawl tighter, her thoughts turning once more toward the Idol House, where men had dressed their greed in the robes of gods and found, as they always did, that the price of deceit was rarely paid in coin. And though she told no one that night, Miss Marple understood at last what the river had hidden and what the tide had returned.